passed down by the gods and goddesses. So they come from a divine source spoken to people who then orally pass these traditions down. Does that sound familiar? That's exactly how the Jewish tradition was passed down. That's how the Christian tradition was passed down. And that's how the Muslim, and I do mean the word Muslim, tradition was passed down, right? So the idea of oral tradition is just typical, and then we have these written texts that come into existence after time. We could spend weeks and months talking about what that really means when you have such a long history of oral tradition. But we do believe, and they would concur, that these scriptures that are now written are in the form that they were intended to be by this divine force, and that they were written into a time period in history when they were supposed to have been written. And so these are called Shruti texts, okay? So of those, the Vedas, okay, are the texts that are the most essential. And so you've seen that I already talked a little bit about this. And the Vedas, so when you ask a Hindu, like, what are your sacred books, they would probably use the word Veda before they'd use any other word, okay? And so Vedas are a kind of Shruti, which is the heard or the oral tradition passed down from a divine being, okay? So let's look at the Vedas. They arrive in the present form between the years 1200 and 200 before Common Era, or BC. Again, this is a time in history when many written texts start to come into existence. It's not hard to understand why texts are being written down at this time period in history, because now we have all of these wonderful abilities to write and communicate this way. And they are made up of 4 different compositions. And so the thing about them is that each Veda then has 4 parts to it. So there are 4 Vedas, and then within the 4 Vedas, there are 4 other parts to it. We're not going to get into all the nuts and bolts of it because it's just too complicated. We could go down a rabbit hole and never come back out. So what we're just basically going to do is look at these 4 very briefly of the way that these Vedas are put together. So you have the first one, and I'm no expert at saying these words, so if you think that you can say it better than I'm saying it, please pronounce it for the class, because I'm just, doing my best here with these Sanskrit words. So the Samhitas, so these are hymns of praise to God, okay? Hymns of praise. So is there anything in the Christian or Jewish tradition that you might liken this Samhitas to? The Psalms, right? So we pray the Psalms, which are one of our most glorious writings of the Old Testament that talk about, all of these Psalms of thanksgiving and these Psalms to King David and these royal Psalms and all this. So that's what we can liken that to. Then we have the Brahmanas, okay, Brahmanas, okay? So this word Brahman is significant in Hinduism. We'll come back to it, but just so you know that this is kind of how they do their ritual prayers. And a priest is called a Brahmin, and so that's where we get this name. So what can we liken this book to in the Christian tradition? To a lectionary, right? Or to the say it again? Yes, of course there's a word, that not the Book of Rites. Well, the Book of Rites works, but it's just gone from my head because you said lectionary. Okay, it's gone from my head. But yes, so written down to kind of give people and give priests and the guidance on how to do rituals. And then we have the Aranyakas, okay? And again, this is a book that they would use for worship and meditation. This might be a little bit more personal, okay? And then we have the Upanishads. And these are like the mystical teachings. These are kind of like, I would liken these to perhaps the Song of Solomon in the Hebrew text. And so that's basically what the Vedas are made up of. Now, again, underneath each one of these is another subset of 4. And you can find that out if you're interested in it, but like I said, it's too much of a rabbit hole from this perspective for us to go into tonight, okay? So those are the most important scriptures, but they're not necessarily the most well-known scriptures, which is kind of interesting. So the next scriptures are called the Smriti Scriptures. And they get this name because they are called the remembered tradition. And these are not always considered to be as important because these are not necessarily considered to be divinely inspired. So the Vedas are divinely inspired. These are basically epics or stories that have been passed down and told. And typically these epics and stories are legends, and they're legends about their gods and goddesses. So what can we liken that to in our tradition? Maybe some of the lives of our saints. Maybe the book of Joshua in the Old Testament, which is really just a big, huge legend about the conquest of Canaan, right? So that's the kind of writing that we're talking about here. And again, these are not really considered to be as important, but some of these are actually much more well-known than the other writings. And two of the most famous ones, which this is the one that I'm actually most familiar with, which is the Bhagavad-Gita. Have you heard of the Bhagavad-Gita before? So do you know who uses the Bhagavad-Gita as their main text? The Hare Krishnas. Are you familiar with the Hare Krishnas? Right? So you guys, you have to remember this because you're all around my age. Do you remember when the Hare Krishnas and the Munis were all the rage? And my parents thought I was going to be kidnapped when I went to college. I was going to be kidnapped and put into a cult, which was either going to be the Munis or the Hare Krishnas. And the Hare Krishnas actually, I personally would not consider a cult, but at the time in history in which the Munis and the Hare Krishnas were becoming so well known, the Munis I would consider a cult. But the Hare Krishnas were kind of recruiting the same way that the Munis were. They were inviting people to come to meals, come to their place of worship, and some people would join and then, kind of disavow their families. So they got this idea that they were very cult-like. In reality, the Hare Krishnas are really considered to be a branch of Hinduism, an offshoot of Hinduism. And Krishna is one of their most well-known gods. And so the Bhagavad-Gita is, it's the world's longest poem. And it talks about this dialogue between Krishna and Prince Aruja. And it's all about, this idea of all these things that Krishna does. Krishna's always blue. You can see Krishna is the blue god, and then the charioteer is underneath there. So this is a very, very well-known epic. And in fact, the Hare Krishnas, Krishna is their main god. This is their main text, and they have built this whole religion up, as I said, as part of an offshoot of Hinduism. Yes, they did, and they always had their saffron roses on, or robes, their saffron robes on. Yeah, and they were bald. So the whole thing was so foreign to Westerners, right? And it was kind of scary. So there's a Hare Krishna temple in Moundsville, West Virginia, right near the prison. They bought this property and they built this really amazing community, this temple. And when I was a graduate student, I was in a class that was exploring alternate religious traditions, and we went to this temple in Moundsville. My parents literally, they thought they were never going to see me again. They thought they were going to kidnap me in the middle of the night and never see me again. It was really an interesting experience, truthfully. Very interesting, in many ways. But, okay, and then this is another very well-known, the Ramayana, and this is about Prince Yama. And Lakshmana and his wife Sita. So this is just, again, this is some of the imagery when you go to really kind of look at these texts. This has artwork, all kinds of artwork like this associated with the actual epic. This is quite ancient artwork, and it's really very beautiful. But this is another one of the epic tales that you might engage in as a Hindu. Okay? So any comments or any questions about their religious texts?
There's different temples. Are they all different, following a different god?
Yes. Well, not necessarily, but possibly. And so they wouldn't all be reading all of the same things. They would be using different kinds of rituals depending on who the god or the goddess is. That short video I was going to show you shows him worshiping in one of the antechambers, and he has very specific rituals that he does. Some of them are practiced generally, and some of them are practiced specifically depending on who the god or the goddess is. Some of the practices are very general, though, and we'll talk about some of those in a minute. So, because when we talk about the deities or the gods, it's going to depend on who it is. And so, there's this kind of, I don't know what the word, I wouldn't say it's a saying, but it's kind of like a response that some Hindus would give. When somebody would say to them, how many gods are there in Hinduism? And they'll say 330 million. And it's not that there are 330 million, but they're talking about this idea of infinity. And there are so many, and so you're dealing with this idea of infinity.
Still revelations going on within Hinduism. Like for Christians, they stopped with
In terms of the Bible, you mean like the Bible's?
Are they still?
So what I would say about that is I don't think that they would understand Revelation in the way that we do. I think that what they would say is that God is not knowable, so therefore we can come to understand God every day in our lives. We should be seeking that, but it's not the kind of a revelation where God is presenting himself in a certain way and we are understanding that revelation. So I think it's more a very personal. Hinduism can in many ways be a very personal, self-driven religious tradition. It's interesting, Hinduism and Buddhism are very individualistic, but yet they still are communal. I would say Christianity and Judaism and Islam are very communal, but can be individualistic. And I think that that is an actual difference. We all seek community, but for Hinduism and Buddhism, they can be perfectly happy with their worship practices doing them alone if they wanted to. Whereas we would say that we're lacking on some level if we're not in community. But yet Hindus and Buddhists do worship together. Okay? The interesting thing about about the deities within Hinduism is that they all have human attributes. And so, what do you think about this idea of God having these human attributes? Obviously, we have Jesus Christ as an example within Christianity. But Judaism does not have any sense that God would have human attributes, right? Islam would not have that sense because Muhammad is certainly not a god, and Muhammad is a prophet. What do you think about this concept that they have unlimited, unknowable beings, but yet the ones that they can refer to, the ones that they have stories about, have all human attributes? They have other kinds too, but what do you think about that in terms of a way to understand God? Makes it relatable? Is that what you said, Kathy? We don't have any frame of reference, right? So that's what Jesus does for us, right? So the same kind of a thing. Were you going to say something else, Kathy? Yeah. Yeah. So if we had more time, one of the things that I would ask you guys to do, and you probably would hate this, but it's so much fun. I love doing this. I do this with my kids, is I make them describe God in words. So if you could describe God. And after they describe God, then I make them draw God. because see, in Hinduism that works, right? So when we're studying Hinduism, and they can't do it. They cannot take these words that they, okay, God is merciful. Like I can picture merciful. Like I can picture that in my head. There's so many kids that can't encapsulate that into a picture. It's funny though, but like I think about colors too. Like colors matter. Like the fact that Krishna is always blue, that there's a significance to that. That the blue is a very godly color and it gives him more kind of a specialized place in the myriad of gods that they have. So it's interesting though. So, but if I said to you, start to describe God, we would not describe God as, he's got, well, some people would say he's white hair and a long beard, but that's kind of a kindergarten would say that. But what if I said to you, describe God's attributes, and then take those attributes and then put them into a fashion that is relatable to humanity, so that if somebody looked at this, what would it tell you about that God? I think that there's a lot to that, and I think that that's part of what Hinduism does. It takes these attributes and it's a way of describing this God or goddess's history and their story that comes along with them. So we'll look at some of those images in just a minute. But here's the thing, and this is why some people would actually argue that Hinduism is monotheistic. There is one ultimate reality, and that ultimate reality is called Brahman. Okay? Now, this word Brahman is used for other things, but this particular use of the word Brahman is the ultimate reality. And this ultimate reality is the single point that is I don't want to say this is God, because that is too confining in Hinduism. This ultimate reality is the thing that everything, human and spiritual, becomes part of in the end. It's similar to Buddhism, but not quite. But it says Brahman is this ultimate of everything. And Brahman is in everything, and everything is in Brahman. So when you think of that, I don't think that that's an unusual concept for a religious person, right? I certainly believe that God is in everything and everything is in God. They call it Brahman, okay? And they would say that all of these other gods and goddesses are lesser than Brahman. They are not as big as, nor do they contain the fullness of Brahman. And this is why some Hindus themselves would say they are monotheistic. But then others, and typically Westerners, will say no, because you have all these other gods and goddesses, so that makes you polytheistic. I don't particularly care what people, want to call it, monotheistic or polytheistic, but that's language that is common in religion. So Brahman is transcendent, and what they say is that the five senses cannot contain Brahman. I love that, right? I love that so much. So we think we know, and when we think we really have it all figured out, we're really sunk, I think. Like there's so much more to learn about God every day, and so that's what they say, the five senses can't. And that, as we talked about this, that, everything is contained, and this is the life force. So this is their end point when they talk about an ultimate being, okay? But within this, then, we have Brahman manifested in these many different gods and goddesses. Now, these are the primary gods and goddesses. And so, all right, so let's just look at this first, and then we'll ask that question. So these are the three primary gods. So you can see now, it's not really unusual to have a hierarchy of gods when you talk about pantheons of gods, right? So if you think about Greek mythology and the pantheon of gods, like there's gods who supersede other gods, who have more power and who, can do more, or they have whatever, right? And so this is kind of the idea we're talking about here, although they would not call this a pantheon. we talk about this idea that Brahman is manifested in ways that we can understand. And the three primary symbols are Brahma. So you can see these words can sometimes get confusing. So Brahma is creator God. Vishnu is the preserving God. And Shiva is the destroying God. Does this remind you of anything? The Trinity. This is very much like the Trinity, right? Tell me who's who in the Trinity. So Father God, creator, would be Brahma, right? You think the preserving God is Jesus? I would agree. I think the preserving God is the Holy Spirit, right? Because Jesus leaves and he says, I'm sending my advocate to be with you for all time, right? And so the preserving God is really Vishnu, would be the Holy Spirit. And why would Shiva be Jesus, the destroying God? He destroys sin, right? Jesus destroys sin, right? And so you can see, again, I think we talked about this, or I mentioned it. When I say we talked about this, you guys don't talk a lot. I talk mostly. Sorry about that. But I mentioned in, I think, the first class, how similar religious traditions are, but we use different language to talk about them. And I think that this is, again, one of those places where we have different names, but the concepts that we have to have a creator, we have to have a destroyer or somebody who takes away the evil, and then we have to have somebody who preserves us in our everyday life, right? The breath of God that preserves us. And this is, just not, it's, again, it doesn't matter the names you give them, but it speaks to this ultimate knowing of what it means to be human and be in relationship with something that is much bigger than we are. I think it's beautiful. So this is Brahma. So Brahma is the creator God. Why do you think Brahma has 3 heads? See, this is what I love to do. I want you guys to analyze this image and tell me what you see in it. I think it's beautiful.
All 3 images of God.
This is only Brahma, though. This is the image of Brahma. 3 different directions. What's Brahma holding? A lotus flower, which is very significant in Hinduism. The prayer beads, which again are very significant in Hinduism. Yeah, it's like, think about, like, what does a creator God need to be able to do? See everything, right? Yeah, always have its eyes on its creation. Looking in from the north, the south, the east, and the west. I mean, I think there's so much in it that speaks about this idea. Yeah, I don't know what the gold pot is. I wonder about that one. I think I've had Hindu kids tell me before, Hindu students tell me. And then he's holding a remote control. No, I don't know what that is. Looks like, yeah. Bringing it right up to the 21st century. So this is Vishnu. So you see Vishnu, Vishnu has that blue tint. Look at Vishnu's got 4 arms. They're really beautiful images, aren't they? I could stare at them forever. The coloring. Now, I will tell you this, if you went online and you searched images, they're not going to pull up the identical images, but they're going to have very similar looks and appearances to what you're seeing. They might be just different renderings, okay? And then Shiva. So Shiva is our destroying God. So look at Shiva's kind of, what Shiva is holding on to, and again, multiple arms. Got a snake. Yeah. I wish I had 4 arms. Could you imagine how much work you could do with 4 arms? It'd be confusing. Yeah, I think they're quite beautiful. So now, here's a couple images of some lesser gods. So this is Lord Krishna. Krishna is often portrayed as a young prince. Yes? The symbolism of the, what's the word? Oh, the cobras. I can't tell you, I don't know that. I don't know the answer to that. I apologize to you. I don't think it has the same, let me think for a second. I know the snake with the Canaanite. I can't imagine that that would be the same kind of influence, though. I'll try to find out for next week. So this is Lord Krishna. Again, Krishna is oftentimes portrayed as a very young, he's called Prince or Lord Krishna. Oftentimes portrayed as a very young man, but then you'll also see images of him as a young adult as well. And then Ganesha, I just love Ganesha. I just love this image. I did have a Hindu student, and this was her goddess. Ganesha was her choice of goddess that she felt very compelled by. Ganesha, the one that has the elephant. One of my students, yes. She has the elephant. I mean, I think Ganesha is fascinating. And this young woman could explain everything about all of this imagery. That's the other wonderful thing, is when they take on this god or goddess, they learn and they grow in this understanding of who this is and what their backgrounds and their stories are. And then this is Durga. Lions are very significant, very majestic, obviously. See how many arms Durga has? And so the reason I picked these is only because I like them. Truthfully, like you could go on and you could Google like Hindu gods and goddesses, and you'd pull up hundreds and hundreds of different images. And I would never be bold enough to tell you I know a whole bunch about any of them, because I don't. But I just love these and the way they look. I think that they're fascinating. They tickle my imagination. I love when things tickle my religious imagination. So they all have kind of similar facial, you can see that they're right. They're kind of similar and yet different in the characteristics that they display for us.
Well, except Ganesha has the head of an
Ganesha has the elephant, yeah. I think, if I'm not mistaken, there's a story in her background. Oh, I don't want to tell you that because that might be incorrect. I don't want to give you incorrect information. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what they believe about humans and how they see this bodied spirit that we are and what that looks like to walk through this life in this body. So they believe that we have an essential nature, okay? And this essential nature is not skin and bone. This essential nature is called the Atman. This is the real self. And they believe this is the ultimate reality of any human person. So what would we liken the word Atman to? To our soul, okay? So they would say we are souled bodies, but they would call the soul or this essential element of humanity the Atman, okay? So now we have the Atman. And then they say that this stuff that we see and our emotions, those are not real. Okay? They would say that these are all just illusions, and they would call this Maya. And they would say that these illusions or this Maya really gets in the way of our ultimate self. So the Maya works against the Atman. Now, there's a little bit of a difference here in our understanding of a soul in Christianity versus this understanding of Atman. And one of the differences is that we would say our emotions are actually part of that thing that we call our soul, right? We talk about in Christianity and Catholicism our soul being those things that are other than this bodied part, but that make up who we are. So our emotions, our mind, all of that kind of stuff. Our godliness is all part of our soul. So they would say emotion is going to contradict your true self. Now, I kind of like that a little bit, right? Because our emotions can get us real confused and real wrapped up in stuff that doesn't necessarily work in a positive way. And so they would say that when you get too dragged into this is going to distract from your ultimate self. And so what they're basically doing, their whole life is about one thing. And the one thing that their whole life is about release. So they want to be released from this body and these emotions that tie them down to this world, and they want to go back to Brahman. Does that sound familiar? So we talk about, this body that ties us to the earth is not the end, and that this will take us ultimately to achieve oneness with God. So that, again, is very similar. But the way that they talk about it is different in the sense that they say you have more than one try. And actually, on the first go-round, it's not going to work because your soul is way too young, okay? So what they're trying to do is they're trying to get to moksha. And so moksha is basically this release from this earthly world where we have finally worked our way through this system, and working our way through the system has gotten us to achieve oneness with Brahman, and now we're fully realized, and our Atman now becomes part of Brahman, okay? So how do they then release from this union with this earth? And what it is it's reincarnation. So we're going to talk about reincarnation, but I would like to know, what do you think about reincarnation? Look, if you guys say that you think it's a great idea, like you're not, nobody's going to cast you out of the church. It's just an interesting concept. And I'd like to know, does it tickle your imagination? Do you think it's possible? Do you think it doesn't make any sense? What do you think? Judy?
I oftentimes thought that people that had difficulty doing things and it seemed to be not slow, but just not understanding and not able to do things were on their first life. I mean, I was a young kid and I believed that.
Okay.
And I believed in reincarnation because I thought when they came back with more skills and more release of emotions or what's tethering them.
So that's really interesting. Now, when you believed that, had you dabbled in religion, or that's just kind of a way that your mind worked?
That's the way my mind worked. I was not even into too much religion at all when I did.
Did you understand that there was such a belief as reincarnation?
I mean, I know the term reincarnation, but when I would see things around me, I wasn't into bugs or animals, but it was just people. And I believed that was a possibility.
That's interesting. See, that's the thing about it. I think it's because we have a belief system that says you live one life, and then at the end of that life, you go to purgatory, most likely, or you go to hell, and some really super duper people go straight to heaven.
Or maybe hell is just being reincarnated until you get it right.
Okay, all right. He said maybe hell is just being reincarnated until you get it right. So you would argue, no, maybe you wouldn't argue this, I don't want to put words in your mouth. In that, if you follow that path, does that mean earth is hell?
I would say yeah.
You would say yes. Okay. Some people do believe that. I don't, because hell would be an absence of love, and I've experienced love in my life.
Oh, well, that's true.
So that's a very common thought, though. Very common. Were you going to say something?
Well, I said not everybody. I mean, because if you have a lot of wealth, this is a good life.
Okay, so it depends on what kind of life you're living.
Yeah, now, do they come back as animals or something like that?
Hold on to that thought for 1 minute. We'll talk about it, okay? Yes?
Problem I have with the concept of
get better with each try.
Yep.
So it's retry. Well, what if you never do any better? Because ultimately, the physical world is going to end. There will be no more life for anybody.
Okay.
What happens then? You're still being reincarnated.
Okay, so Bill's saying when the world ends, what happens if you haven't yet made it? Actually, that's a really fascinating question. Nobody's ever asked me that before. And I don't know if they would perceive a world ending the way that we do. I don't know that that's like part of their theologizing about reincarnation, but it's a really interesting idea.
I take it from a scientific.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, the sun is a star. It's going to.
It's eventually going to evaporate, yeah. I'm going to make an educated guess, and I'm going to say that they would say at that point everything would then be part of Brahma. Become just the ultimate, it would just take itself back.
Because they're trying to achieve a state of perfection, aren't they? Isn't that?
Yes, they're trying to achieve a state of enlightenment. Yes. So, again, this is similar to Buddhism. Buddhism has a little bit of a different way of talking about it, but they would say that when we are enlightened, we then don't need to be tethered to this earth, and that we are released from the things that tether us to this earth, and we become one with Brahman. And Brahman, remember, is in all things, right? So then Brahman is my beautiful cat, Juniper Rose, that all the souls that have achieved Brahman are part of my cat, and our grass and everything living is all Brahman. So all of those who have achieved Brahman are also present in all things living, which is also kind of a beautiful thought, right? Yeah. Anything else about reincarnation? Then we're going to get to some of these. Anybody else think it's fascinating, or they just think it's crazy?
I know people who live by reincarnation. There's a group in Seattle that actually the whole group meets, and they all believe they are reincarnated.
They all believe they're reincarnated.
Actually, they're very convincing.
And so she's saying that she knows a group that in Seattle where they all believe and they're very convincing. Why are they convincing? How does?
They have memories. They have memories that are historical, that are past memories, that are extremely detailed. For example, this may be their imagination. I mean, I think it's their imagination, which is vivid, but.
But they claim to have historical memories.
Yes, they claim to. And
Yeah.
different time periods.
Different time periods in the world.
Different
Are they practicing a religion, or this is just something they believe?
No, they do not practice.
It's just reincarnation. They believe in reincarnation. It's very interesting.
None of them belong to any. I'm trying to remember. No, but two of them are in end stage of their own life, and I shall be very interested. I wish I were sitting with them when they.
Yeah, have them tell you when they're done what's happening.
I know. I would like to say quickly right now. I mean, they're an elderly group, so they are very convincing. They're very convincing, but also mad, in my opinion.
In your mind. So having said that, they're convincing, but you don't buy into it.
Convincing, but I don't believe it.
You don't believe it. So you believe in a linear life, birth, death, afterlife. Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah, there was a famous book, Search for Bridie Murphy.
Bridie Murphy?
Bridie Murphy. And it was this individual that had historical
Uh-huh.
knowledge
Yeah.
of what happened
Yeah.
and all that. And it turned out that what she was professing was actually stories that were told to her by
Okay.
somebody else. And so it was
And they did debunk it.
disproved, yes.
Okay. So he's saying, for those of you who are not, he's saying there was a book that was debunked because it was somebody who said they had this historical memories, but they were actually stories told to this person. Yeah. Interesting.
If you look at that, God is not through with creation yet. That creation is still going on, which could possibly be because we know that the universe is still still continuing. Then, what happens, we may not be the perfect creation of God yet. So maybe we do come back with more perfection.
So we come back with more perfection.
What would perfection mean?
So what does perfection mean? Go ahead.
Well, as they said, more perfection with Brahma, more in tune to
Yeah.
the whole universe. than we are.
So you know people, I know you know people, and some of you are probably sitting in this room, who have a deeply, deeply, deep spirituality, right? Deep spirituality where, I think about, do you guys know Father Fred Roos? You know Fred. I think about Fred, and just even some of the way he talks, and his gentleness, and his mercy, and his kindness. And he was at school yesterday offering Mass for the students and talking about his work at the homeless shelter. And he was talking about the chef at the homeless shelter, and he was just enamored with the chef because the chef was displaying this sense of vulnerability with his clients at this homeless shelter, and like knowing who needed what and when. And he would say to Fred, can you take this tray because blah, 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 blah. And Fred's like, the way he told it was so humble. It was so humble, right? He was like, I said, oh, sure. And I could hear in Fred's mind, he's saying, I missed that, but he didn't miss that. And he was like raising this chef up to talk to the kids about, the saints in our lives. But to me, Fred is one of those people, right? So we see these people and we wonder where that spiritual strength comes from and how deep that well is. And why did they get there and I didn't get there, and I want to be there, but I'm not there because I've got too much pride and I've got too much of this and too much of that, right? And I haven't really humbled myself enough, and I haven't really given everything over to God because I'm holding on to the things that make me happy and that make me comfortable. And that's what tethers us to this world. That's what Buddhism says, right? So I'm tethered to my little house in Ponce Inlet and my little cat, and I want to live this perfect little life that I have, and I don't want anything to change, and I want to be able to buy as many Christmas gifts as I want. Well, why am I not out working at the homeless shelter? I should be out working at the homeless shelter and quit worrying about buying Christmas gifts for somebody. That's what I think. That's what goes through my feeble mind. But other people are there. Even people, little kids that are, I've met. So a little girl, one of my sister's best friend's daughters died at 15. I know that little girl was a saint. Just her whole life was saintly, and then she died at this very young age. And you wonder what would have become of her if she had lived a long life, what she would have done. You can only imagine, right? So ultimately what they're saying is that those kind of people that we all know, or that some of you probably are, have progressed through this life or multiple lives to get to this life. So Fred would have lived multiple lives, and now he's living this life that is much more, in our terminology, saintly and deeply spiritual, right? And that would be an old soul. And so that's what it would look like in reality. Or in Christian reality, Fred's gone through a lot of struggles in his life, and he's just been very prayerful about everything, and he's aging into this deep spirituality that hopefully we all age into if we choose to be in relationship with God, right? So that's a different way of looking at it. But I don't know. I don't believe in reincarnation. I think that there's some problems with it, because like some of the problems I have with it, like are there a certain number of souls? Like, think about it, right? Are there only a certain number of souls and they keep getting reborn? Why do you think that's so funny?
This is so Catholic.
It's so Catholic. But I do think about that. I think, like, are there 7 billion, and there can't be 7 billion and one, and then so only 7 billion souls can be on earth at the same time, and then, I don't know, some of that confuses me, like, I don't know.
Well, maybe it's like mining Bitcoin.
Like mining Bitcoins.
Recycled, but there are a few new ones that come along.
Yeah, I don't know. It's really interesting, but there's some things about it that are fascinating and some things about it that don't make sense to me. I don't know.
Don't you think, in the same way, though, you know, our lives don't end, they, as we say, we change.
Right.
You know, that our soul is out there. It doesn't have to be back on this earth, but we gain something.
Yeah, I don't think the soul goes away. And yeah, but where does it go? Does it go directly back to Creator God? With a pit stop in purgatory if you're Catholic, right? Because very few of us are going straight. It's going to be a detour. So let's look at this a little bit then. So what they say is life is cyclical. Now that part I do love, because really this is the Paschal mystery, that life is cyclical, right? Birth, death, and rebirth, reincarnate, or we would call resurrection, right? But we see that around us every day. We see it in, flowers that die and that go back to the earth and they become mulch for the next flowers that are going to grow, right? So life is cyclical. And we talk about life being linear, human life being linear. So we say there's a starting point, and then there's an ending point, and then that ending point transitions us into a different experience of existence. But they would say that this is a cyclical experience. And they do say that the way that you are born and reborn again is determined by karma. Now, we have all used this word, right? The most typical is, karma is a B, right? People like to say, oh, karma's a B, because somebody does something wrong and the next thing you know, they're getting smacked down and you're just like, Italians don't say that. Italians say bumbat. You kind of get what you asked for, right? But that's the idea of karma. So the form the soul takes is going to be determined by one's behavior in life. And we basically choose our own fate because we are fated to being in the next life as good or as evil as we are in this life. And that this is just part of the cycle of life, death and rebirth until we achieve a level of spiritual depth, enlightenment that unites us and releases us from this cycle. That ultimately then reunites us with Brahman, which ultimately reunites us with all of living things. Okay? So, what about animals and what about insects and things? I have to be perfectly honest with you. The jump from insect to mammal, I'm not saying that right, to four-legged mammals or, dolphins, to humans doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I have read different things about reincarnation, that you can be, in fact, reincarnated as an animal if you're really bad. I have also read where reincarnation stays within the human life cycle. In the human life cycle, it makes a lot more sense, but they do have this sense of sacredness for all living things. And so I think this is where some would say that there are sacred animals that there can be reincarnated, like cows. So cows are very sacred. And these sacred animals are revered in a way that they will not kill them. Even though people are starving, they will not use them as any kind of food source. Now, when I tell you these things about Hinduism, the thing that you need to understand is that these are the practices of one who is working hard to be the perfect Hindu. So in other words, even in Hinduism, we talked about this in Islam and in Judaism, and we know it in Christianity, there are people who do this much, there are people who do this much, there are people who do this much, and people who do this much, and they all call themselves under this one thing. So the ideal of Hinduism is we are vegetarian. We do not kill anything. We don't kill insects. We don't kill anything. That's not a reality for many people who will call themselves Hindus. okay? So this is what you're trying to look at as the highest level, right? So they believe that cows can grant wishes, and that every part of this animal is filled with a deity. So you can see how you get this kind of confusion when you talk about reincarnation within animal life and within human life. But the easiest really way to understand it is within the chain of humanity, and we're going to look more fully at that in just a minute. But one of the other things I want to mention is this idea of passive resistance. This comes as Mahatma Gandhi is the person who really brings this understanding of passive resistance into Western thinking, right? So he was a leader who was Hindu, and he was living in a time when there was great bias against Hindus in the part of the world he was in, because Muslims were the dominating religion, and he brings this sense of passive resistance against not only Muslim rule, but against British rule, right? And so he's in India, he's trying to liberate India from British rule, and then he wants to form a unified government between Hindus and Muslims, and that all went terribly awry, and this is where we have partition, and we have Pakistan being formed in India, and people being put into these different countries. People don't realize how terribly violent and bloody partition was. It is as bad as the Holocaust by some estimates. And it was really religion against religion when they were fighting for control of the leadership of India. And this is after Gandhi's whole life freeing this continent from British rule, and then it turned into this terrible legacy of partition. And today still, the border of Pakistan and India, do you guys ever watch, have you ever seen the guards when they do the little battle, like they do this ritualistic battle, and people come to watch it at the partition line. People come to, you could watch it on the internet, it's fascinating. So at the partition line, every single night, the Indian soldiers and the Pakistani soldiers, they do this shutting down the guard for the night, and they do this big ritual, and it's kind of like they're doing this dance off, but it's like a soldier off. It's really crazy, and it's still happening today, and we know that there's still a lot of unrest in that part of the world. But again, this is the legacy. Gandhi's legacy was passive resistance, and he preached this and said, if we believe Brahman is in everything, if you truly believe that, it's just like what we say. If you truly believe that we are all images of God, we are created in the image and likeness of God, we breathe the very breath of God, how can you treat your brother or sister like this, regardless of who they are? And really, Christ is our first, he's the legacy for us, but yet here we have this human person who leaves this legacy for Hinduism and says this is the way we should live in the world. Have you guys seen the movie Gandhi? If you haven't, you should watch it. Some of it, there's just some pieces of it that are so acutely, it is, but then there's just these places in it, like a Muslim man, it must be a Hindu man comes and he says he killed him, I think it's in the movie, he killed a Muslim father of a son, and he said, what should he do? And he said, you should take the son and raise him in your house, and you should raise him as a Muslim, and that's how you repay this harm that you've done. Oh, okay. Yeah, it's really quite beautiful. It's quite beautiful. So then, and this really is very interesting within Indian culture, because this speaks directly to reincarnation, is that they have something called the caste system, okay? And so the caste system is basically really bluntly being transparent and naming that there are different social groups, and the different social groups have different status. And status is dictated by your past lives and your karma. And so what they would say is that if you are in the lowest caste, then you have been a terrible person, and you were either reborn back into it, or you were born into it and you never were able to achieve moving out of this caste because you did not do enough to reincarnate into a higher caste. So reincarnation in the concept of the caste system makes perfect sense, because what they're saying is what we get in this life is what we deserve in this life because of the way we've lived in this life. So when you keep it in the context of human souls, it makes sense, right? So when you look at the caste system, this is how it works. So you have the Brahman, there's that word again, but you can see that it's written differently, right? And this is the priest and the academics. And then we have the warrior and the king. I'm not even going to try to say that word. And then we have the merchants and the landowners. And then we have the commoners, the peasants, and the servants. And then you can see at the bottom, completely separated away from the pyramid, is the untouchables. So you're familiar with this term, the untouchables? Yes? And again, you see this in the movie Gandhi. He makes his wife go clean toilets, and she is very angry at him because this is the job of an untouchable. And he says to her, you know, nobody's better than anybody else, go clean the toilets. You know, he basically says we all clean toilets. It doesn't, you know, the caste system is, and the caste system is legitimately outlawed. Now, when we say it's outlawed, I want you to think Jim Crow, right? We outlawed slavery, but we did not outlaw the caste system in our country. And that's exactly what is happening in India. They outlaw the caste system, but it's so embedded, it's institutionalized in everything about the people that it probably will never, ever really go away. The other thing I'd like you to look at in the caste system is the order of importance of the castes. So let's talk about this in terms of our culture in the United States. So who would the priests and the academics be? In our culture. So I'd be a Brahmin, because I'm kind of an academic, kind of a priest too, sometimes people think. Father Phil would be a Brahmin, right? Okay, so then who would the warriors and the kings be in our culture? Politicians, and who else? Who would the warriors be? Military, right? And then what about the merchants and the landowners? Those would be small business owners, right? Probably even maybe Fortune 500, because they would be the merchants, right? People who farm. Then we have the commoners, the peasants, and the servants. They're unfortunately the same in every culture, right? The commoners and the servants. And then we have our outcasts, which would be our homeless people, right? Would be all kinds of people that are marginalized in our society. Here's the other thing that's interesting. When you look at this and the level of importance, it's so different than our society. And even within our society, like the warriors, the priests, and the academics, even economically, don't get paid as much as, right? It's kind of this whole flipped way of thinking of what they value in terms of what we value. It's a really flipped way of thinking, which is, it's kind of interesting that they value academia and the priests as these are the most the most important people in our society. And these people have achieved a level of enlightenment that goes beyond everybody else. So it's kind of interesting. So basically what they would say is if you are a good warrior, then there's a chance in the next life you will be born as a Brahmin. But if you're not a good warrior, you could very much wake up one day, die, and come back tomorrow as an untouchable. And untouchables, because they are considered to have done something to deserve this status, then it's okay to mistreat them, right? If I can say, well, you earned this place in society. I didn't put you there, you put yourself there, which we sometimes do to people with no good reason. They at least have like some logic associated with it, right? That says, karma, you must have been a really nasty person in your former life, and guess what? You're born into this untouchable life, and you better be a good untouchable and earn your way out of this, or, this misery is brought upon by yourself. And so it's kind of sad because it's easy to dismiss people when you can say you did it to yourself. We like to do that with people who are homeless, don't we? Like, well, you must have done something or you wouldn't be homeless, right? Like, it doesn't matter what the circumstances were that led you to the homelessness. We're all deciding for them that they did something that brought them to this place. But they say they brought themselves to this place and they know it for sure because of this and because of karma. So it's a little bit of a cop-out to me. Yeah, I don't really like that idea very much. All right, so we already talked about this. Yeah, so the jobs that they have are like the kind of jobs nobody would want. Like they're the ones that clean out the porta potties, or they're the ones that are picking up the trash and, stuff people don't want to do in their everyday life. And we talked about this. So people are bound to their caste until they die, which is really kind of interesting because this is one of those places where, especially in the upper castes, people might intermarry caste to caste. And then what caste do they really belong in at that point? So that's frowned upon, that they should marry within their own echelon of society that they're in. And there are certain things that are defined by caste, like the clothing that you wear. Sometimes your religious practices have to do with your caste. So there are this idea that you do these things and you stay with your kind. But again, it's illegal. So they're trying to raise up the dignity of people, right?
Church over there, we had 2 Indian priests when I was up in Michigan that were over here for a while, and talking to the one went back and he was in the diocese working for the bishop. The other one came from the south of India. He had multiple churches, and they gave him a bicycle. They wouldn't even give him a car. And
Even though he was a priest, he was still in a lower caste.
yes.
Interesting. Huh. All right, so let's talk about some of the festivals within Hinduism. So Holi is a wonderful, wonderful festival. We've hijacked Holi in the United States, and we use the color thing. Have you ever seen like the 5Ks that are the color races where they throw colored chalk all over each other? Have you guys seen these? Oh, they're beautiful. This is all from the tradition of Holi. So you take and you throw. You can buy it online. You throw colored, and it's because this festival is the festival of colors. And so this festival is related directly to Krishna, right? And so they throw colored powder. They suspend the caste system for the day, and basically what they're celebrating is this idea of good. It's a spring festival where they're celebrating new life and good overcoming evil and rebirth and all the things that we celebrate in spring, right? The colors are wonderful. If you ever get a chance to look at a Holi, oh my God, they're so fun. Yeah, it's really very cool. It's a great celebration. And then another very important festival is called Diwali. And this has to do with these legends. So Rama is returning from exile. Rama is an avatar of Vishnu. Avatars are different embodiments of gods and goddesses. And so avatars are very popular in cartoons. There's all kinds of avatar cartoons that the kids watch, and there's like the airbenders and all this if you have kids and grandchildren who ever watch this stuff, but this is all like the idea of this. And this, they signify Diwali with all this, again, very colorful. They have put lights outside. They put, I don't know if you've ever seen the lanterns that float in the sky and all that. Everything's lit up. It's very bright. Their festivals are very uplifting and very beautiful and celebratory of all the beauty around them. And so this is in the fall. Oh, is it this Thursday? Yeah, it could be. And one of the things that they do as a sign of hospitality is artwork called Rangoli. And so typically what they do is they will, outside on their stoop, on their doorway, they will take powder again or the chalk dust, and they create artwork with it. So some of the Rangoli is, some of it is drawn, some of it's colored, and then some of it's literally done with the powder, which we're going to, I hope, from my lips to God's ears and to PowerPoint, we're going to watch a beautiful video next week within Buddhism because they use this kind of artwork within Buddhism. One of the interesting things about the Rangoli art is the swastika is actually an ancient Hindu symbol that was hijacked by the Nazis. And so when you see Rangoli art, you will often see symbols in it that look like the swastika. And people who are unfamiliar with Hinduism can be highly offended by it because they don't understand it. But actually, the Nazis hijacked it from Hinduism. So you will see it sometimes in the Rangoli art. And so then the temples, typically what happens is it's very common within Indian cities that there is a particular god for that commonwealth or city or whatever they call their areas, right? So we might have a god for Daytona Beach, and then we might have a god for Volusia County, and there would be one for Ormond Beach, and you might have your own temple that would have the temple that would have the attributes of this god or this goddess for this particular. And then when people come from India and emigrate to the United States, typically that's the god or the goddess that they're most prone to worship is the one, and think about it, so this is like their childhood memories, their community has celebrated this way, they have this imagery, they've had these celebrations and these rituals, and now this is what they bring and that they continue on themselves, and that's how we have so many different renditions in people's households. And so usually, what they'll do is not usually, but they do something called puja. So puja is a ritual, and it's a way of honoring their deity, okay? Now, I actually saw this when I went to New Vrindavan, to the Krishna temple, when we went and we got up at 4 o'clock in the morning and we did this ritual practice with them, where what they do is they have these very elaborate altars, and they come in and they'll wake the deities up with bells, and then they'll sprinkle flowers, and they'll bring food, and they'll bring the food in, and they'll feed the deities the food, and it's always the best. The first offering to the deity, and then after that, some of the food is shared with the community. And then this is a way of kind of, in a sense, breaking bread. And what's this put you in mind of? Where we offer our first to God? Yeah, well, think even about in the Jewish tradition when they would do sacrificial animals, right? You don't sacrifice like the runt of the litter. You sacrifice your very best. You're unblemished, and you bring it to God. And then what do? You sacrifice it, and then you share it with the community. We saw that in, well, I don't even know if we talked about it, but it's in the video within Islam. At the breaking of their fast, they take a sacrificial animal and they share it with people who don't have enough food to eat, right? So this, again, is a common practice, but the way they do it, it's that they prepare the food. It's not an animal. It's prepared yogurt and different fruits and vegetables and things, and then they bring it out, and they take care of the god or the goddess, and then they will partake. And home shrines are very, very, very common. So it could be a small little closet that somebody would have a home shrine in, and some people some people who have some means, they might have a whole big room in their house that is a home shrine. Now, these home shrines, again, are going to be dedicated to their personal deities. So you might have the family whose home shrine is the shrine to Krishna, but then you might have one of the children in the home who is going to have their own shrine in their own bedroom, and it'll be a smaller shrine to Durga or one of the other gods or goddesses. And again, this is perfectly acceptable practice because this is what ultimately we want people to relate to the god or the goddess that best meets their own spiritual needs. And then the Ganges River, this is considered to be the most sacred place on earth. And it is, for them, this is the symbol of reincarnation. This is the symbol of life without end. Now, the interesting thing about the Ganges River is that they use it for everything. And so even in the ritualistic way that they use it, then they use it in very practical ways. And so the Untouchables will use it to bathe. They'll use it to wash their laundry. And so what's happened is the Ganges River is one of the most polluted rivers on the planet. Yes, it's quite unfortunate. But a lot of people ask to have their ashes sprinkled. So this just gives you a sense of how the Ganges flows. And all along that river, people will be living, there will be industry, and you can see why they think of it as this kind of never-ending. And this is an image of like just life in and on, but it's more in the river. Like it's right there, right? It's kind of incredible how this stuff was built. And then this is kind of an everyday image you might see of people just living their lives in this sacred water. But it has overwhelmed the environment. And that is it. Any questions?
They're all cremated.
Yes. Yes. Commonly, they would do a very ritualistic cremation. It wouldn't be something like we would do in the United States where we would send a body away and there's ovens. It would be funeral pyres, not uncommon, not always, but not uncommon, that they would do the ritual burning themselves.
Any ashes would be.
Well, most people want their ashes sprinkled in the Ganges, right? But so there's a difference really between that kind of ritualistic kind of burning and a funeral pyre and like a real cremation. So you're not going to get the heat to actually disintegrate a body properly, right? So I'm not sure if they would do both. They would do a ritualistic funeral pyre and then they might have a formalized to take the body to the place where it literally can be sprinkled.
I would think they tolerate other religions other than Hinduism.
They do tolerate other religions other than Hinduism. Yes. Having said that, there is still a sense that the whole reason partition happened was because they couldn't tolerate the Muslims, right? They didn't want the Muslims to be the government, and the Muslims didn't want the Hindus to be the government. And so even when we say they accept all the truths of all the religions, you always, always, always have a spectrum of believers. And Gandhi was of the spectrum that said it doesn't matter what religion people are. And then you had Hindus that said it absolutely matters what religion people are, and these Muslims are not going to rule us, right? So you have this whole spectrum, and you're going to have it everywhere you go.
Yeah, but I would think that like the Protestants, Catholics that are there, they're not, what you just mentioned was a political.
Yes, political, but still based on religious sectarianism. So if you're a Protestant or a Catholic, I'm sure that you would be very comfortable in living in this place because it's not the kind of a thing where, Yeah, yes, but they would also be tolerated because they would consider it harmless. They wouldn't consider it to be of any significant threat or any significant value. It's just another way of talking about God. That's in the perfect ideal mind of a Hindu. Like they would never.
You know, from what you just showed us and
Mhm.
told us, does the average Hindu, are they into all that? Because that's complicated. I mean,
I don't think it's really complicated. I think it's very simplistic in the way that they live. The idea basically is that we need to be the best version of ourselves, and the way that we are the best version of ourselves is being in communion with God, whoever that God is or goddess, and understanding that all creatures are striving to be in union with God and live and let live. I really think that that, in a nutshell, is the way that they want to live in the perfect Hindu world. But it's not perfect because it's human. And then you have all of this kind of other kind of ugliness with the caste system as part of, right? And this, so there's embedded in every religious identity is the beauty and the ugly.
you got the ideal and then a reality.
That's right. The living out of the ideal is not easy. Yeah. And people get very protective of their ideals. And that's when it starts to get hard. Yes. Like, not in the same way as it within Catholicism, but there are, like, the thing that comes to my mind is Yom Kippur in Judaism. Not Yom Kippur, I apologize. The Day of Atonement. Is that Yom Kippur? Yes. The Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, where they're obligated to make right any wrongs that they've done in their lives in order to move into the new year. That's part of their responsibility. So it's not confession in the way that we know it, but it is a ritualistic forgiving. Like, we have this obligation to do this, to be right with God. Other than that, let me run through my mind a little bit here. There's nothing like that in Islam that I am aware of. In Hinduism and Buddhism, I don't think that there's any kind of ritualistic activity like that, although I would say that mercy and forgiveness would certainly be an expectation of every great religious tradition, because respect and sacredness is part of every religious tradition. Anybody else? Yeah. Yeah, that is an interesting connection. And really, Hinduism is a place where, when you start talking about religion versus spirituality, I think that there's more of a comfort to say we can commune, we can be in this spiritual journey in myriads of ways. Whereas in some religious traditions, they would say you can only be in this religious journey in certain ways, and that's what makes you this religion. And I think that that is a very different way of thinking when it comes to Buddhism and Hinduism versus the religions that we're typically used to understanding, the monotheistic brand.
Where do the Hindus gather in this area?
I think, as far as I know, and I certainly don't know everything, I know that there's a Hindu temple in Orlando. I don't know if there's anything closer. But again, remember at the beginning I said they have these home temples and these home shrines. They don't see communal worship as a necessary component of Hinduism in the way that we see communal worship as a necessary component in our religious journey. Although they do it, They don't see it as a necessary component. So they would probably go to temple. People who consider themselves Hindu and consider themselves religious might only go to the big festivals to be right, to celebrate the big festivals. And some of the festivals take on a very secular tone, especially in the world today. Kind of how Christmas has taken on a secular overtone. Well, that's kind of happening with some of these. That's why you're seeing 5K races where they're throwing powder all over each other, because we kind of hijacked that a little bit. Anything else? Well, thank you for being here tonight. We're going to wrap up next week with Buddhism. I do hope I'm going to show you a couple videos, because Buddhism's really hard to talk about. It's a lot easier to watch and like see some of these practices. And the Dalai Lama is like, he's like my hero, and I want you to see him, because he's like, I really want him. Him and the Pope. If you could put me in a room with them, I could die a happy woman. Right then and there. The Dalai Lama and the Pope in the same room, I would die a happy woman. So, all right, well, you guys have a great week. Thank you for being here. Thank you, everybody online. Have a great week. God bless.